Welcome to A Guide to Every Deck in EDH. Today we are looking at Kinnan Bonder Prodigy. So Kinnan is a 2-mana Simic commander. He says whenever you tap a non-land permanent for mana, add 1 mana of any type that permanent produced, so mana rocks, mana dorks, and then 7 mana, look at the top 5 cards of your library. You may put a non-human creature card from among them onto the battlefield, put the rest on the bottom. So right away, we've got a mana increasing ability and an infinite mana outlet. So this should say right away that we want to play tons and tons of ramp that is not based on putting additional lands into play, so that we can use Kinnan to produce tons of mana very quickly. And then we want ways of producing infinite mana so we can spin Kinnan into a win. So we've got our card draw spells, again, fairly typical, Sylvan Library, Rhystic Study, Mystic Remora, but we also have big non-human creatures that we can spin into, Consecrated Sphinx, Nezahal. Then we'll skip combos for now. We've got a whole bunch of counter spells, a little bit of fast mana. Then we've got what I'll call Kinnan payoff cards. So these are cards that are non-humans that Kinnan can spin into. So Consecrated Sphinx, Gilded Drake, Hullbreaker Horror, Tidespout Tyrant, Nezahal, Perplexing Chimera, Prophet of Distortion, Seedborn Muse, Thrasios, Void Winnower, and Wandering Archaic. Some of these are combo pieces, others are just value cards. We'll get back to that when we go through combos. But in particular, Gilded Drake is a very good removal spell. Primarily, you steal your opponent's commander, and then they can't get it back until they find a way to bounce or kill it. Perplexing Chimera is sort of a protection spell / steal your best spell. So whenever an opponent casts a spell, you may exchange control of Perplexing Chimera and that spell. If you do, you may choose new targets for the spell. So right away, this being on the field means that if an opponent casts like a Peer into the Abyss or some big game-winning spell, this can just steal that. It can steal their combo piece, etc. Or you can just use it to, like, let's say an opponent casts Swords to Plowshares on Kinnan, then you just switcheroo it with Perplexing Chimera and then change what swords is targeting. Although do note that because you're giving it to the opponent, if you're ever exchanging this for anything other than a removal spell that you're going to switch to Chimera, it means they now have the Chimera themselves and can mess with what you're doing. Seedborn Muse, of course, untaps your lands during and all of your other mana sources, mana rocks, and dorks, etc. So you generate a bunch of mana at instant speed, which at the very least can be used to activate Kinnan's ability. Thrasios is also an infinite mana outlet that doesn't care specifically about hitting non-human creatures. So if you're ever in a combo, you can spin into Thrasios and then just activate his ability to draw the rest of your deck normally. Void Winnower is just a big stacks piece that's going to screw over your opponents by not allowing them to cast even mana value spells. And Wandering Archaic lets you copy opposing spells if your opponent doesn't pay the 2 mana tax for them. And then we'll get back to these combos later. A bunch of lands. We're slightly down on the number of lands that we have at only 27, but it doesn't matter too much because Kinnan's producing a gargantuan amount of mana himself. It matters that we have cards like Treasure Vault because we can potentially pop the Treasure Vault. So if we have an infinite combo that, say, only produces colorless mana, we can pop the Treasure Vault, make infinite treasures, and then use those as infinite colored mana to then spin Kinnan. Of course, Gaia's Cradle, of course, Boseiju, Minamo, etc. Seagate and Turn Timber Symbiosis are in here because, hey, sometimes you produce a bunch of mana, but you don't have a payoff for them. May as well play these. We don't need colored mana that badly in terms of producing dual lands, and we've already got enough over here anyway. A little bit of protection in Spellskite and Veil of Summer so that we don't have our Kinnan killed or countered. And then we're going to have a whole bunch of ramp, including notably Basalt Monolith and Grim Monolith. So Basalt Monolith will go infinite with Kinnan because Kinnan makes it produce 4 mana when you tap it. So you can then untap it for 3 and always net 1 colorless mana, which again harkens back to the Treasure Vault over here. So Kinnan plus Basalt Monolith is infinite colorless, but you then cannot spend that infinite colorless to spend Kinnan. So you do need a way to transfer that colorless into colored mana, or just find a way to spend the colorless mana on something else to win the game. And then just a whole bunch of other ramp spells here. So Mana Dorks, Mana Rocks, we're good. Then some removal, bounce spells in Alchemist Retrieval and Chain of Vapor, and Colossal Sky Turtle. Turtle is also a card that you can spin into with Kinnan, although spinning into it is not really that helpful, but it is a retrieval spell / bounce spell that's also hittable off Kinnan. We've got Rift. Then we got a bunch of tutors, which include tutors of various kinds. So some creatures will win us the game, thus Finale, Shared Summons, and Worldly Tutor. Some artifacts can win us the game, thus Fabricate, Transmute Artifact, Trophy Mage, Whirr Invention, Reshape, Tezzeret, and Moonsilver Key tutors up either a land or an artifact with a mana ability. So this is almost always just going to be Basalt Monolith, but we can get other things. And then we've got 2 clones. which are also hittable off Kinnan. So then coming back up here to the combos. So Hullbreaker, Horror, or Tidespout Tyrant do the traditional Tyrant loops, where if you've got mana rocks that produce more mana than it costs to cast them, if you have at least 2 of them, you can bounce them back and forth. So example, Soul Ring and Mana Crypt. You have a Soul Ring in play, you tap it for 2, you cast a Mana Crypt, you trigger Hullbreaker Horror, you bounce the Soul Ring back to your hand, you then have the Mana Crypt in play, you tap the Mana Crypt, you cast the Soul Ring, you bounce the Mana Crypt back to your hand, you produce infinite colorless mana, you produce infinite colored mana if you have a colored mana rock like Mox Opal, Mox Amber, etc. So those are ways of just going off like that. And so the idea is that you will eventually, so with this, you can then produce infinite colorless mana or potentially infinite colored mana and spin Kinnan more, or you can just bounce whatever your opponents are doing. Prophet of Distortion is an infinite mana outlet that draws cards. So like Thrasios, you can pump infinite colorless into this, and it's also, once again, a non-human creature, so you can find it off of Kinnan. So you just do these effects and then eventually draw your whole deck, or just loop bounce spells over and over and over. Now, technically, none of this outright kills your opponent, although if you ever assemble both Hullbreaker and Tidespout Tyrant, you can then just loop them both. So what you do is, if you get both of these in play, which you can do just by having one of them in play, producing infinite mana, and then Kinnan spinning into the other one or drawing into the other one. So you then, let's say, have, again, Soul Ring, Mana Crypt. It doesn't really matter. As long as you have 2 spells, you can loop back and forth. So you cast it, the Hullbreaker / Tidespout Tyrant will trigger, and you'll bounce one of the 2 rocks back to your hand, and then you'll use Tidespout to bounce a permanent back to your opponent's hand, which is going to be all of their lands, all of their permanents, and that'll basically win you the game. So although there's no like Walking Ballista or any way that you just outright immediately win the game, you will get to a point where you basically just bounce all of your opponent's permanents and then put a bunch of creatures that are huge into play, and then you'll essentially just win the game off of that. Like, you don't actually have to win the game immediately, because you're just going to render your opponents unable to do anything for the most part, plus have a board full of gigantic monsters that will then kill your opponent pretty quickly. So one thing is, do not underestimate how quickly you can get Kinnan into play, or how quickly you can get mana with Kinnan, because every single mana dork is now producing 2 mana. Every single mana rock that would normally produce 1 is now producing 2. Mana rocks that are producing 2, like Soul Ring and Mana Crypt, are now producing 3. You just generate an absolute gargantuan amount of mana off of Kinnan. And then, for other ways to actually combo, you do actually have straight up ability to win the game with Walking Ballista, although notably, you cannot spin Kinnan into Walking Ballista, because it'll enter as a 0/0 and die immediately, but you can spin Kinnan into Thrasios, into Prophet of Distortion, and then use those to draw your way into Ballista. You've also got Dramatic Reversal for Dramatic Reversal shenanigans. You've got Stonework Pack Beast. This is in here as a way to filter colored mana into, or colorless mana into colored mana. Now, there are multiple cards that do this, so it doesn't have to be any specific one of these, but you only need one. So Stonework Pack Beast, it's a non-human creature, which means Kinnan can spin into it, and then you can generate as much mana as you want, or you can just generate a bunch of colorless mana and then use Pack Beast to filter that into colored mana and then spin Kinnan. You've got Agatha's Soul Cauldron as a way to make it so that all creatures have the same activated abilities. So if you've got a Soul Cauldron into play, then you can actually just activate Kinnan until you find Ballista, put it into your graveyard, and then use Soul Cauldron to exile the Ballista, and then everything is a Ballista that can put infinite counters on itself and infinitely damage the opponent. Or if Kinnan dies, then you can put Kinnan into your graveyard, exile it, and then put the counter on something else, and then spin your new Soul Cauldron Kinnan into whatever you need. There's multiple ways of using the Soul Cauldron to go off. Again, like Thrasios. If Thrasios puts in your graveyard, you exile that, put a counter, then you've got Thrasios activations. And then the last one is Mirage Mirror. So this one is a little more complicated. This is another way of basically changing colorless mana into colored mana. So what you can do with Mirage Mirror is you have any land that produces colors, so blue or green, and then you have a Basalt Monolith, right? And then Kinnan, right? So Basalt Monolith produces infinite colorless, and then you do the following. You activate Mirage Mirror infinite or, an arbitrarily huge amount of times, and you target in alternating amounts Basalt Monolith / a land or anything that produces colored mana. So the first Mirage Mirror ability will resolve, and it'll become a copy of, let's say, Tropical Island, right? So you activate the Tropical Island, producing blue or green. Then the second copy ability resolves, and it becomes a copy of Basalt Monolith. Now you can use the infinite colorless that you have to untap it. Then the next ability resolves, it becomes a copy of Tropical Island again. You tap it for blue or green. You do this over and over and over, filtering your infinite colorless mana into infinite colored mana. Or you can just use it to copy other stuff if you want to, but it's primarily a way to filter the colorless mana into colored mana. It can also just be a way to pseudo save stuff. So like if you've got a Mirage Mirror in play plus Kinnan, and then your opponent or not Kinnan, let's say like Thrasios or something, right? And your opponent goes like instant speed, Swords to Plowshares, Thrasios. Then you go copy Thrasios. Now you've got a Thrasios in play. So yeah, it's mainly going to be getting Kinnan out as fast as you can, plus as much mana ramp as fast as you can, and then finding a way to assemble one of these infinite mana loops, and then once you have an infinite mana loop, you just Kinnan spin your way into Tidespout Hullbreaker or some other combo, or you just find Ballista, you use Thrasios or Prophet of Distortion to draw into Ballista, and then win the game that way. It doesn't specifically have to be Ballista, you could win the game in other ways, but for the most part, you want your combo pieces to be things that are fetchable off of Kinnan, so that you just need Kinnan in play and not anything else. And yep, that is pretty much Kinnan Bonder Prodigy.